Education in Zimbabwe is under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education for primary and secondary education and the Ministry of Higher and Tertiary Education, Science and Technology Development for higher education. Both are regulated by the Cabinet of Zimbabwe. The education system in Zimbabwe encompasses 13 years of primary and secondary school and runs from January to December. The school year is a total of 40 weeks with 3 terms and a month break in between each term. In 1980, education was declared a basic human right by Robert Mugabe, the leader of the ZANU Party, which changed the constitution to recognize primary and secondary public education as free and compulsory. One of Zimbabwe's Millennium Development Goals was to achieve universal education for all students. However, the goal was not achieved as of 2015 due to a public health crisis, economic downturn and inability to afford costs associated with education. The country is currently working toward the Sustainable Development Goal of providing universal and free education to all students by 2030. History. Colonial government to 1980. The British South Africa Company arrived in the 1890s to Rhodesia, the area now known as Zimbabwe, Malawi and Zambia. The company administration of Rhodesia created Christian missionary schools to serve local communities. Missionary schools provided an education for the indigenous population that focused on agricultural production and industrial development including carpentry and building. N.J. Atkinson claims that in order to control the local population, the company limited education and censored knowledge in schools. Furthermore, he argues that the Eurocentric education system was a structural institution that reinforced the superiority of white settlers even though they were the minority of the population. Missionary schools perpetuated social and economic repression of the indigenous population by reducing their chances of earning well-paying jobs or positions of power. Ruggery Mapikor claims education to Africans offered limited academic and foundational skills in order to promote labor exploitation and indentured servitude. Limited access to a quality education kept Africans subordinate to white colonists in order to advance British political and economic gains. Europeans were also disproportionately funded more for education than the majority African population because the Rhodesian government controlled access to quality schools based on race and ethnicity. Segregation of schools based on funding was most extreme in the 1970s because Europeans only represented 1% of Zimbabwe's population, but were allocated 99% of government spending on education. Funding secondary school was also disproportionately offered to Europeans rather than Africans. In the 1970s, only 43.5% of African children attended school, while only 3.9% of these children enrolled in secondary school. In 1979, a new Zimbabwe-Rhodesia government called for an education reform that created a 3-tier school system. The Education Act of 1979 regulated access to each type of school through a zoning system based on residency. Before the Act, Zimbabwe's education system was divided between African and European schools. After the shift in policy and leadership, the education system split into government schools, community schools and private schools. Government schools were also split into 3 divisions called Group A, B and C. White students historically attended Group A schools that offered highly trained teachers and a quality education. These schools were located in white suburbs that denied housing opportunities for Africans, reinforcing segregation based on ethnicity and race. Group B schools required a low fee payment and C schools did not require a fee beyond educational materials. Both were only available for African students. Group B and C schools had less resources, funding and qualified faculty compared to Group A schools. National education reform. In 1980, the Rhodesian-Bush War from 1964 to 1879, a 15-year guerrilla war, catalyzed the shift in power from British colonial rule to de jure sovereignty in 1980. The ZANU Party, Zimbabwe African National Union, won the national election in 1980 and took over the historic white minority government in Rhodesia. The ZANU Party democratized education by promising free and compulsory primary and secondary education to all children in Zimbabwe. The party's claims were backed by the national constitution, which recognizes education as a basic human right. All primary school tuition fees were abolished after independence. Dr. Jingai Mutambuka was elected the Minister of Education to support Zimbabwe through another education reform and to keep students in school. His leadership changed the climate of the education system because the Ministry of Education focused on fostering self-sufficient students that are productive, motivated and dedicated citizens. The government allocated 17.3% of the total national budget toward education. This was politically considered an education miracle, as cited by scholar Clayton Mackenzie. Ultimately, Zimbabwe's education system reform was to ensure equal access to education by providing primary and secondary education to all children. 1980s and 1990s. Since independence, the government focused on providing equal and free education for all through the rapid expansion of education resources to keep up with the demand. Within 1 year, the education system nearly doubled the number of students it served from 885,801 students to 1,310,315 students in primary and secondary education. Exponential increases in the number of students attending school heightened the need for more infrastructure and teachers. Teachers were in high demand immediately following Zimbabwe's independence. In the mid-1980s, thousands of refugee children from Mozambique migrated to Zimbabwe, increasing the number of children attending public schools and need for teachers. The Minister of Education brought in teachers from Australia, Britain and Canada for a short period of time to fill the teaching gaps. Schools expanded their human resources to serve as many children as possible with limited infrastructure by practicing hot seating, also known as double-session schooling. Hot seating is the practice of offering class in the morning to half of the students and in the afternoon to the other half. Hot seating was still not enough to meet the demands of the population. Therefore, the Ministry of Education expanded teacher education colleges rapidly by providing on-the-spot teacher training. In 1986, 8,000 additional teachers were trained to meet national demands. Communities also rapidly built more infrastructure for education. For example, from 1979 to 1984, the number of primary schools in operation increased by 73.3% and the number of secondary schools increased by 537.8%. Despite the challenges following the magnitude of students to educate, Zimbabwe claimed to achieve universal primary education by the end of the 1980s. By the 1990s, primary schooling was nearly universal and over half the population had completed secondary education. 2000s to present. UNICEF claims that the country's education system was once the most developed on the continent. Although the system continues to suffer from a contemporary decline in public funding linked to hyperinflation and economic mismanagement, a decrease in GDP by 40% from 2000 to 2008 marks a period of economic downturn in the first decade of the 21st century. Social expenditures on health and education also decreased by more than half. By the end of 2008, most schools and hospitals were shut down due to thousands of teachers leaving the profession, an economic crisis, an increase in HIV and AIDS, and an outbreak of cholera in 2008 leading to a national epidemic. UNICEF asserted that 94% of rural schools, serving the majority of the population, closed in 2009. During this period of time, UNICEF also claimed that attendance rates plummeted from over 80% to 20%. The economy regained momentum after 2009 once the Government of National Unity was formed. This is an inclusionary government developed to resolve national challenges. The Government of National Unity suspended the Zimbabwe currency to implement full dollarization, reducing hyperinflation and increasing social expenditures. Zimbabwe's focus on expanding education opportunities for the past 25 years has led to national accomplishments, including achieving the highest literacy rate in Africa at 91% from ages 15 to 24. As of 2014, 3,120,000 students were enrolled in primary and secondary education, and 76% of these students were enrolled in primary education. Governance after independence. Non-discriminatory policies after nearly a century of British colonial rule. The Zimbabwe African National Union took over Zimbabwe and formed an independent country in 1980. The newly formed government created free and compulsory primary and secondary education, valuing education as a fundamental right. This fundamental right was clearly articulated in the Education Act of 1987. The Act also abolished all methods of discrimination from the Education Act of 1979, the Education Act of 1996 and the Disabled Persons Act of 1996 furthered non-discriminatory policy by requiring that all students, regardless of race, religion, gender, creed, and disability, have access to basic or primary education. These non-discrimination provisions expanded the right to education in Zimbabwe for all students, including students with disabilities. Decentralization of authority. The Education Act of 2006 established school development committees. These committees are overseen and established by the School Parents' Assembly for parents and guardians of school-going children to participate in the development of Zimbabwe's schools. According to the government's statutory instrument 87 of 1992, the purpose of school development committees is to provide and assist in the operation and development of public schools, advance the moral, cultural, physical, and intellectual welfare of students, promote the welfare of the school for the benefit of its present and future students and their parents and teachers. School development committees have many functions to control the quality of the school system. Their powers include the recruitment and dismissal of teachers, the preservation of facilities, and the act of borrowing money and applying for grants. These committees also decentralize the education system by enabling parents to elect 5 other parents to lead a school. The decentralization of schools combats the highly centralized structure of the government in hopes to assist the operation and development of education. Education ministries. In 2013, the government created the Ministry of Education, Sport, Arts and Culture to foster social cohesion, economic empowerment, and educational development in primary and secondary schools. The Minister of the Ministry of Education, Sport, Arts and Culture was Andrew Langa until President Mugabe fired Langa in September 2015. Langa was replaced by Makhosini Longwin and the ministry's name changed to Ministry of Sports and Recreation as of 2015. Currently, government primary and secondary schools are run by the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education, and non-government schools are run by local authorities including churches and non-profit organizations. The Minister of the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education is Lazarus Dokora as of 2015. The Ministry of Higher and Tertiary Education, Science and Technology Development oversees public and private universities and technical and teacher education. The Minister of the Ministry of Higher and Tertiary Education, Science and Technology Development is Jonathan Moyo. Education stages. A list of early, primary, secondary and tertiary schools and providers can be found at Zimbabwe's online school directory. Early education preschools are directed by the Early Childhood Development System under the Ministry of Primary and Second Education. Early childhood education is offered for children from the ages of 3 to 5 through the ECD. According to United Nations and the Southern and Eastern Africa Consortium for Monitoring Educational Quality, Zimbabwe is prioritizing and expanding early childhood development by offering early childhood education at primary schools. These programs are currently available in mostly urban areas and can be owned by the government, organizations or individuals. In fact, 98% of primary schools have ECD centers for ages 4 to 5 and 60% of primary schools have ECD centers for ages 3 to 4 with trained teachers. Primary education. Zimbabwe's education system mandates 7 years of primary school, encompassing grades 1 to 7. Urban primary schools teach in English. Rural primary schools teach students in their local native language, typically in Shona or Ndebele, then transition to English by grade 3. Student-to-teacher ratios are typically from 30 to 50 students per teacher. However, this varies based on location, the country's economic state and yearly budget for education. The curriculum in primary schools encompasses language, art, contents and math, based on the Education Secretary's Policy Circular No. 12 in 1987. The minimum expected educational outcome for all students is functional literacy and numeracy by the end of primary school. At the end of grade 7, students take a national examination in mathematics, English, Shona or Ndebele, and the general paper covering social sciences, environmental science and religious education. Zimbabwe's government system requires education for all, but this examination can determine the type of secondary school students can attend based on the school's criteria. Private or religious schools typically have performance requirements, but many rural public schools allow mass admission, regardless of performance on the examination. Secondary education. Secondary education is not funded by the government and students can attend private boarding schools, government boarding school or day school, all with an enrollment fee. Secondary education is made up of 2 cycles, the General Certificate of Education, or Ordinary Level, for 4 years and the General Certificate of Education Advanced Level, or Advanced Level, for 2 years. This structure was adopted from the British system of education. Students take classes in mathematics, English, science, Shona or Ndebele, geography, and history. The ordinary level certificate examination is taken after 4 years in grade 11 and expects students to pass a minimum of 5 subjects including science, English, mathematics, history and a practical subject like woodwork or agriculture. This examination is ranked on a letter scale and can determine student achievement, selection for A-level schools and employment status. Students have the option to enroll in A-level secondary education or can attend teacher training, technical, agricultural, polytechnic and nursing colleges. If a student chooses to enroll in A-level education, they must take the advanced level certificate examination after a total of 6 years of secondary education administered by the Zimbabwe Schools Examination Council. The A-level examination is required for entry to universities in Zimbabwe. Tertiary education. The tertiary sector of education is operated by the Ministry of Higher and Tertiary Education, which includes universities, technical, polytechnic and teacher training colleges and various vocational training centers. Tertiary education was first introduced to Zimbabwe in 1957 by the University College of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, now known as the University of Zimbabwe. The nation's independence in 1980 expanded the University of Zimbabwe's enrollment from 2,240 to 9,017 by 1990. The National Council for Higher Education was established in 1990 as a measure of quality assurance of higher education in Zimbabwe. Increasing access to education in recent decades has increased the number of higher-level institutions in the country. For example, 8 more universities were established between 1999 and 2005. The Zimbabwe Council for Higher Education was formed in 2006 as another measure to guarantee quality and accreditation for university education. As of 2012, there were 15 registered universities, 15 teachers' colleges, 8 polytechnics and 2 industrial training colleges.